Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this very important panel. Let's get the first slide. There you go. Anybody recognize it? Perfect example of an American estate garden in the early 1900s because of its axial parterre, classic architectural elements such as the pergola and pavilion and water features, plus its wonderful layout. In his 1902 book on American estate gardens, the architect Guy Lowell summed up the prevailing fascination with formal Beaux-Arts gardens that were derived from France, Italy, and Britain. And of course, the Olmsted firm and other landscape architects of the period considered this approach the absolute norm. However, there was another side of the coin, and that was the more informal cottage gardens that were being popularized through books such as those by Alice Morse Earle. Old Time Gardens and Sundials and Roses of Yesterday, published the exact same year as the Guy Lowell book. The cottage garden tradition, of course, was adopted by home gardeners. So throughout her distinguished career in the 1890s through the late 1930s, Beatrix Farren relied, of course, on the Beaux-Arts approach to garden design. And Crosswicks, which you're seeing a plan of here, was a substantial estate garden that she did for the Newbold family of Philadelphia. And here she envisioned the garden as a series, just like here, a series of parterres with defined rooms. Farren's travels in Italy and France in 1895 was what really defined her approach to classical garden design, which she kept throughout her career. And possibly one of her most famous achievements, of course, is Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., which was designed in the 1920s, once again, as a series of garden rooms and terraces. But it was also distinguished by her extraordinary planting expertise, as well as the architectural features, many of which she designed herself, including the statuary, the fountains, the arbors, and so much more. Well, the striking resemblance to the garden here is the Beatrix Farren's Italian garden at the Harkness family estate in Waterbury, Connecticut. As you can see, it bears a striking resemblance because of a parterre, pergolas, a pool, and fountains, which were all originally laid out by the architect James Gamble Rogers, and with the help of Brett and Hall, landscape architect. However, Beatrix Farren came in and she worked continuously on the Harkness estate from 1919 to 1929. So now, I'd like to turn to the work of Ellen Shipman, who simplified the standard Beaux-Arts plan and used it as a framework for her extraordinary plantings. So unlike Beatrix Farren, Ellen Shipman did not travel to Europe, and she was much more influenced by traditional American garden design as expressed in Alice Morse Earle's book, namely cottage gardens, such as this wonderful example of a long-vanished Ellen Shipman garden on Long Island done in 1919. Well, in her heyday in the 1920s, Shipman combined a simple framework with informal details, such as this incredible setting for her borders. Usually it was a combination of her planting expertise consisted of a combination of annuals and perennials. This is one of a vintage color slide that comes from the Archive of American Gardens collection at the Smithsonian, and obviously shows rather over-dazzling borders. Well, in the era of deep pockets and trained gardeners, Ellen Shipman thought nothing of creating parterres entirely from annuals, such as this one vignette at, I don't know if anybody recognizes it, Chatham Manor in Fredericksburg, Virginia, she did in the 1920s. It's now part of the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Site. And of course, the National Park Service does not have the resources to completely restore this period garden, nor would they ever envisioned doing it. But instead, they are now working, this is a nice preservation story here, they are working with a local friends group and garden club to create a demonstration garden inside the old walled parterre to educate visitors about Ellen Shipman and her planting palette. Well, Ellen Shipman, who lived in the Cornish Art Colony in New Hampshire, trained with the architect Charles Platt in the 1910s. And it was then that she learned how to use architectural features such as pergolas to enhance settings for her garden. This is a Platt design for a pergola at Dingleton House. Well, when she renovated her own farmhouse, located not far from there, she added a simple pergola to frame the view out to her borders and also to provide a luxurious place with shade to dine out. These are all vintage slides that were photographs that were taken by Mattie Edward Hewitt, mainly in the early 1920s. Well, after learning drafting and design skills from Platt, she then launched her successful career, eventually designing over 600 gardens. This is one example, a plan that she did in 1916 for a garden on Long Island, showing gradations of color gradation, mix of annuals and perennials. And early on, it's 400 feet long, if you can imagine. And it took trained gardeners to do it. But at the time, I wanted to show you this early plan, very typical, because she always had these charming vignettes that she put right straight on the plan, hoping to entice her clients to add a pool or a pergola or an arbor. Classic pergola designed by Ellen Shipman in her early career that is so magical the way it doesn't conflict with, it just balances perfectly with her extraordinary borders. And here we are once again back at Chatham Manor, a series of color slides taken by Frances Benjamin Johnson in the 1920s shows her creative use of a pergola, where the pergola doesn't stand out, it's just the framework for the beautiful plantings. An arbor at, some of you may recognize this, the Sarah P. Duke Gardens in Durham, North Carolina. She designed them in the 1930s. Provides a focal point at a complex garden, one of the most complex gardens that she did, and in the end was not terribly successful. 6 descending terraces. On the left, you can see it in 1936 with co-eds enjoying the gardens, and then a more up-to-date view of what the gardens look like. The gardens have been open 24/7 since 1936. It is a public garden, and of course her complex plantings have had to be significantly simplified due to maintenance issues. A very aggressive Chinese wisteria was recently removed from the arbor that she designed. Well, Ellen Shipman was a master of incorporating pools as architectural elements, and this is a reel in a Massachusetts garden that she designed in the 1920s. And what is so interesting about it, I don't know if anybody recognizes it, she lifted it directly from the pages of one of Gertrude Jekyll's books, Gardens for Small Country Houses. Happily, the garden has been partially restored and is now open for Garden Conservancy Open Day in June. More often than not, she used rectangular tanks, very much like the garden here, or the pool here. This one, a garden in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And these pools were not features in themselves. They were meant to, once again, to offset the plantings, to reflect the shadows from the sky, and also the different textures of the plants. A classic Ellen Shipman pool here in the recently restored garden. It's called Minna Edison's Moonlight Garden in Fort Myers, Florida. And here we have a charming arbor that she has designed to go with it. And this, one of my favorites, a tiny teardrop garden, reflects the overhanging wisteria. And of course, we have the gardener out there every morning sweeping up all the petals from the pools. Wisteria, as you can imagine, was one of, aggressive as it was one of her favorite signature plants. She often enhanced her gardens with statuary, some actually designed by Cornish colony artists. This, a long vanished garden in Greenwich, Connecticut, shows Piping Pan that was designed by Louis St. Gaudens, who was the younger brother of Augustus St. Gaudens. Here is another slide from the Archive of American Garden Collection, showing a statue by Edouard Mccartan, long vanished garden in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, an area where she eventually designed over 60 gardens. Fortunately, when the garden was destroyed, the statue was saved and it was relocated to a nearby garden that had also been designed by Ellen Shipman. Well, this remarkable lotus fountain that you can see in the vintage slide on the left from the Archive of American Gardens collection is a private garden in Delaware for the Eugene DuPont family. A typical Ellen Shipman garden, the pool, the beautiful statuary, the axial paths, the low boxwood, the fruit trees, and then this incomparable planting. Well, this is one of the great success stories. This property is now a private country club, the Greenville Country Club. And after reading the first edition of my book that came out way back in 1996, the country club decided to restore the gardens. Not a paint-by-numbers restoration, but loosely interpreting it. The beautiful garden house at the end was actually designed by Ellen Shipman. She was a superb designer of small garden buildings, too. Well, in the late 1920s and 30s, Ellen Shipman began using these elaborate pavilions that you can see in many of her pictures. This is one at a property called Rose Terrace in Grosse Pointe, once again, sadly razed to the ground. Absolutely, in the 1970s. There's no historic district commission in Grosse Pointe. In many cases, long after Ellen Shipman's gardens have disappeared, it really is the architectural features that remain. Here are two more of these classic Shipman pavilions, one at the Henry Ford Estate in Michigan, and the other, the one on the right, comes from the former James Cox Brady Estate called Hamilton Farms in New Jersey. Well, she also designed small garden houses or dovecotes that served as practical buildings, always practical, to store pool equipment, garden tools, as well as sometimes they were used as a pavilion for ladies to have tea in the garden in the afternoon, as well as a design point for the garden. This is a classic photograph from the 1920s, so showing the Sir Samuel Salvage Garden on Long Island. Now it is the home of Villa Bamfy, which is a wine importer. And once again, the plantings and all the trees and anything is pretty much gone, but the beautiful dovecote is still there today. Unquestionably, Ellen Shipman's most famous extant garden is Longview House and Gardens, which is in New Orleans. And she did that in the 30s and 40s. And this is where we find this delightful, what we call pigeonnier, that she modeled after an example on a local plantation that was being torn down when the river was banked up. It provides a focal point for the garden. This is the part of the garden is called the Wild Garden. Well, whatever the size of her garden, she always created enclosure. Whether it was the evergreen background, which is famous that she used for most of her gardens, or these beautiful low stone or brick walls that you use. This is a classic restored, reinvented Shipman garden. It's located in Lake Bluff, Illinois. And here we have the original stone walls for a garden in Ohio called Halford Farms. It was one of her big commissions in the 1920s, and the stone walls are still there, and these beautiful hand gates are still there. Here's a vintage picture showing that same garden, and you can see this Chippendale-inspired gate and her construction drawings for it. She used it in numerous projects, and once again, it's often the gates and the dovecotes that last while the plantings have long since overgrown. She created many different variations on this gate. This is the Haynes Garden in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. But right down to the last detail, Ellen Shipman always included benches in the gardens, whether it was of her own design, as you can see in the left slide, or the classic Lutyens bench that you can see in the right-hand slide. She was one of the first women to use the famous Lutyens bench. And then brick pathways were another way that Ellen Shipman brought interest to her beautiful plantings. Another Archive of American Garden slide, this one in Lake Forest, well vanished. And here one in Massachusetts, Tranquility Farm, not in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, beautifully restored Ellen Shipman garden with the original brick paths. And now, the best for the last, the story of Ellen Shipman's Italian garden at the Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens in Jacksonville, Florida, recently restored with a major hiccup from Hurricane Irma's recent visit. Designed in 1931 for the Cummer family, probably at the recommendation of Edison. This is one of the very few archival photographs that actually show it as it was planted and installed. The plantings vary quite a bit from what Ellen Shipman recommended, because the client herself was a garden club woman and a keen horticulturist, and she wanted to do things her way. Just very quickly show you the plan, where we have two flanking pools, and we have, like Gertrude Jekyll, we have the cool borders around the pools, and then this hot episode at the end of the garden that overlooks the St. John River, called the Gloriette. It proved exceptionally tricky to try to figure out how to restore this garden, because all the azaleas they put in immediately died. They had to be treated more as annuals rather than perennials. A number of photos that were taken several years ago that show this incredible restoration that was done with modern day plants, and the restoration of the Italian fountains that were put in the garden, acquired on the client's trip to Italy in 1930. Well, the fact that the garden had been designed by Ellen Shipman was discovered only when a client was reading the first edition of my book in 1996 and happened to see the name Cummer under the state of Florida. By that time, no one had remembered that the garden was designed by Ellen Shipman, and that volunteer ordered plans, a complete set of plans from Cornell, and set in motion the story. Thank you.